All right. Well, good afternoon, late afternoon, I should say, to everyone. Welcome. My name is Jacqueline Rodriguez, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager with Toronto Arts Foundation. And we're delighted that you're able to join us today for this webinar. My remarks will be very brief, as my role here today is really to be a moderator for our Q&A later in the session, and to help troubleshoot any technical issues that might come up. As some of you may know, the Foundation is hosting this webinar as part of our Creative Champions Network. Ginny Stolk, our network director, will be giving you a brief overview of the program in a few moments for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. With that being said, well, we hope that this is a very smooth session. We're grateful for your patience as we troubleshoot any technical issues that may come up. You'd think that after many months we'd be used to Zoom by now, but you never know. Second on my list is to just set a little bit of a proverbial stage for today's webinar. After the introductory remarks, we'll proceed on with our presentation. If you have a question for our presenters, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Questions tend to get buried in the chat, so we do ask to try and keep your questions to that Q&A function. If your question is for a specific presenter, try and identify them in your question to us so I'll know where to direct it best. We will address some questions if they keep coming up continuously throughout the session, but most will be taken at the end. While we strive to get to as many questions as possible, we will be prioritizing those frequently asked questions. Now, well, no one has requested ASL interpretation for this session. The URLs that might get shared throughout the chat will be made available following today's presentation on our Foundation website. We are also recording this session, and the recording and a transcription of that will be made available on our website. With that, I'll turn it over to Ginny Stolk, our Creative Trust Research Fellow and the leader of Creative Champions Network. To you, Ginny.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you so much. And thanks, as always, to you and Alex for the support for this session and for the other things we do with Creative Champions. Very, very much appreciated. I don't know how many of you who've tuned in today are new to Creative Champions Network, but we've been in existence for around 5 years. We've done almost 30 sessions. Of course, recently they've been webinars, but until this past couple of months, they've been actual networking sessions where we gather and talk about issues that are particular and interesting to arts board members. I think we've done about 29 of these sessions so far over 5 years, and we have a very solid membership of more than 500 board members who've been joining us for these sessions. We will have more webinars coming up in the fall on a range of topics, and we'll be announcing those quite soon. The website of Toronto Arts Foundation has got a very wonderful site that for Creative Champions Network, and you'll see a range of resources and information on the past webinars that we've done. So that's for the new people. For the new people and for everybody else, it's been quite a 6-month period, hasn't it? Looking back, it's actually been fascinating to review how the best boards and the rest have functioned in supporting and making decisions impacting employees during this time of shock, interruption, and transition in the arts and culture sector. The issue of human resources is the topic of our session today. And at this time, using the concept of intersectionality seems not only appropriate, but actually necessary in thinking about the huge number of urgent issues and concerns around work and workplaces in our world. Not only have our sector's employment realities and expectations been almost entirely upended by the coronavirus, us and many others, obviously, but we had or have only begun digging really deeply into the whole issue of decent work, into ensuring safe and harassment-free spaces, spurred by Me Too activism, and equitable and anti-harassment free spaces, equitable and anti-racist hiring and work practices brought into sharp relief by I think, almost universal recognition of the systemic racism against Blacks, Indigenous peoples, and people of color. Not to mention the challenge of continuing to build in whatever kind of normal we see post-pandemic for our sector, fairly compensated jobs and thoughtful employment practices that make it possible for a new generation of artists and arts workers to contemplate a lifelong career in the arts. There's a lot. They're all tremendously important issues. They have immediate practical as well as ongoing and long-term implications for that, what I think is the most overlooked of all necessary resources in our sector, which is human resources, upon which everything that we accomplish in our arts organization depends. Not for the art, and therefore the artists and the arts workers. Why do our organizations exist? Before we go further, I wanted to just point out that many of us, including me, certainly, are taking comfort and inspiration these days from the land, from nature, from things growing, flying, crawling, and sharing the earth with us. So we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the historical and ongoing presence and stewardship of the land by the many First Peoples of this area, and say how grateful we are to be able to work, live, and meet on this territory. One final word. This webinar, there's a lot to cover in the whole area of employment and work and human resources at this point in time. We're not able to cover it all. And I know that many board members may be here with us today have questions about things like when and how to reopen workplaces and bring people together again. We're not experts in that area, and we're not going to reinvent the wheel, especially the perfectly wonderful wheel that Maitree Foundation covered in its 5 Good Ideas session on reopening your workplace post-COVID-19. We really recommend, if that's your issue and your most pressing question, that you go to their website and spend some time with their speakers, Robin Osgood and Dave McKechnie, on these issues. And I think that the link to that session is about to go up in the chat room. Will soon be up in the chat room. So here we go. We have a really great panel. I'm delighted to have 4 people with us whose ideas and expertise and experiences are so rich, and who I think will be filled with information and insights for us today. So I'll just say a few words about the 4 panelists that we have with us. Lucy White has over 30 years experience in the cultural sector. She's a principal with the Osborne Group. She provides consulting services, leadership coaching, and interim management for nonprofit organizations. Her clients include an impressive array of arts organizations, and she was truly immersed in HR and contract issues for many years as executive director of the Professional Association of Canadian Peers. Lucy's on the boards of Friends of the Osborne Collection at the Toronto Public Library and Mindfulness Every Day, and has served on a large range of other boards, including, I guess, specifically to this topic, the Cultural Human Resources Council. Nadia Bello is with us. She's an organization development consultant who works with nonprofit and public sector organizations, including the Toronto Arts Council. She specializes in facilitation and training, investigations, nonprofit human resources and governance, and equity and diversity. Nadia has more than 20 years of nonprofit experience. She's a former elected official on the Toronto District School Board and holds a Master of Science in Organizational Development and is a certified human resources professional. Lisa Marie DiLiberto is the artistic director of Theatre Direct, a company dedicated to creating and producing work for young audiences. And she was the founder of Fixed Point Arts and Media and co-creator of The Tale of a Town, a multi-year theater and media project that's toured to every province and territory across the country. She's got a range of other successful theater and media projects under her belt, and she has an animated series now airing on TV. She's a guest instructor at Queen's, on the faculty at Centennial, is an artistic advisor for the National Arts Center, and she's a leading advocate for artist caregivers through her initiative, Balancing Act. She's also the proud mom of 2 wild children, and I want to meet them one day. Charles Pavia is president of the board of directors of Toronto Dance Theatre. He's been on the board for just over 10 years, which is quite a nice period of time, Charles. But he's been an audience member and supporter since the 11th grade. All I can say is yay. That's great. He's recently been overseeing the transition of longtime artistic director Christopher House after 25 years of leading the company and dancing in it for 40 years. He studied theater directing and dramaturgy at York. He worked at Buddies and Bad Times Theatre in their inaugural Anti-Chamber project as assistant director. And he was also at that time working full-time and became the eventual manager of Theatre Books. For the last 20 years, he's represented artists at Canada's largest stylist agency, Judy Inc., most recently as agency director. So those are our wonderful panelists. We're going to start by asking Lucy White to set the stage for us. Lucy, can you tell us what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about decent work, and what does it mean, and how does it matter to the many board members who are on this call with us today?
There we go.
There we go.
Okay, so that's the jinx. I've done it. We're all good now.
We're all good now?
We're all good now. So thanks, Ginny. I want to start off by saying how honored I am to be invited to kick off this discussion. My fellow panelists have a lot to offer, and so I'm just going to take a very few minutes to frame today's conversation. First, let's define decent work. The Ontario Nonprofit Network, who are a leader in this area, say that decent workplaces are fair, stable, and productive workplaces. Decent workplaces offer equitable pay and benefits, stable work, opportunities for adequate training and development, workplaces free of harassment and discrimination, and hours and schedules that allow for work-life balance. When our organizations adopt decent work practices, we will be better able to meet our missions, attract and retain high caliber professional staff with the skills and knowledge to deliver our programs, and contribute to thriving communities. These are benefits all arts organizations need. As board members, we know that we have the responsibility to steward our organizations, to meet our our fiduciary responsibilities, to provide strategic oversight and direction, and to manage risks. But right now, we are in an international pandemic, which has created a massive risk to the entire arts sector, and simultaneously, a deep desire for change. Many of us don't want to go back to a normal where 2 out of 10 women experience harassment at work, where leadership roles are filled overwhelmingly by white people, where jobs are increasingly precarious, and most of the resources continue to flow to those who already have the most. Some organizations have responded to the pandemic restrictions by laying off staff, closing down operations, and going basically into hibernation. Others are continuing with small, creative moves to keep their connections with audiences and community alive while they wait to be able to reopen their doors. And there's a third group of organizations who are experimenting with new models and practices. How are they doing that? How does a board navigate both survival during the pandemic and take real steps towards change? I want to make 2 suggestions. First, this pandemic is also the biggest opportunity most of our organizations will ever have to pause and reinvent themselves. Scary? Yeah. Risky? Probably no more than waiting for a return to business as usual. Douglas McLennan says, if you think of yourself as a product, a venue, a transaction, and everything shuts down, then you do too. If you're an idea, you understand that now is an even more important time to find ways to lead. The second suggestion I have is that now is the time to put decent work practices into action in our organizations. One of the facts I find compelling about decent work practices is that they require organizations to explore all the ideas, to look at all the ways that the big issues raised by truth and reconciliation, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, basic income, and other movements connect and intersect. And as arts organizations, the home of big ideas, we can use our mission, values, and purpose as the foundation from which to lead the sector forward. I know the community, the theater community best, so let me give you two examples of where foundational ideas, the organization's mission, values, and purpose, have been a catalyst for leading change. Buddies in Bad Times artistic director Evelyn Perry, who is white, has stepped down from her position. She said, Buddies has been reckoning with the inequities of our past and the racism embedded in our colonial organizational structures and practices. It's essential that this company is taking time to revision and create a bold new direction. At Talk is Free Theater in Barrie, they have just launched a pilot project designed to offer about 20 artists a minimum annual income guarantee each year for 3 years. One of their goals is to explore a new, more sustainable operating model for making theater. I'll leave my remarks there, although I could give you many more examples of arts organizations taking small and large steps towards decent work practices at this volatile time. I'm looking forward to what Lisa, Nadia, and Charles have to say. Back to you, Ginny. Thanks.
Lucy, thank you. That was great. This is the discussion part of it. We described this session as dealing with how the best boards have been responding to that task of ensuring that their organizations are decent and equitable workplaces. So what we're going to try and do through our discussion today is balance recommendations on what boards should be doing right now with, as Lucy laid out so beautifully, the many longer term issues people are grappling with. So I want to start out by just giving each of our panelists a chance to describe one or two of what they consider to be the most important initiatives or ways of working around decent work during COVID, but also before and also after. So I think I'll go clockwise, which means Nadia, could you start us off?
Good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for having me on the panel and to all of you for joining in. So as a consultant, I've worked with over 50 organizations, including over 36 arts organizations in the past few years. Everything in every part of the arts and at every level, from small collectives to large funders. I hold the trust of a lot of people very closely, and I really honor that because nothing quite kerfluffles arts organizations like human resources, human rights, and governance, apart from funding, that is. I spend a great deal of time demystifying these things, and it's a genuine joy and pleasure to do so. I do keep a very low profile, but based on what I've seen over the last 4 months in particular, I've decided to come out of hiding once we all caught our breaths from COVID, because I think there does need to be a larger conversation in the arts. Because I hold your trust, I want you to know that I am offering you anecdotal insights and generalized themes and trends that I'm encountering. These are not specific to any one part of the arts, nor are they specific to any single organization. So I'll start with what I think the arts has done right, and that is you kept your people working. I have to say, and you mobilized everything from mental health to, to social justice, to universal basic income, and you did so both in and out of making art or art making. There are lots of other nonprofits who started laying people off from jump, who really were engaging in some very egregious HR practices, forcing staff to use vacation time, not allowing any room for understanding that people are managing children, animals, dependents, mental health while working remotely. But I think the arts as a sector, you sort of recognized this right away and really, really honored it. So again, anecdotal, but I just want to offer it to you as something I think that was done right. There is, however, a price to pay for isolation. And some observations I have for you is that conflict is at an all-time high. And this is what I'm spending most of my time dealing with right now. Conflict between staff and management, conflict between boards and executive directors, conflict between EDs and ADs, or whatever the equivalent is. And it's a really fascinating and also very impactful thing when we're not actually face-to-face. So what's happening here to generate and engender all of this conflict? The second observation is that boundaries are quite smashed, and that's always been a problem in the arts. I'll say delicately, but the pandemic has really highlighted the lack of delineation in roles and responsibilities, in operational functions, in decision-making, and in managing time and time away. And what we're doing is creating narratives as a result, narratives in our own head, narratives on social media, and there's no one to check those narratives. There's no one to check those stories to say, well, where does this assumption come from? Do I need more information about this situation before reacting? Is there an opportunity here, not just for reflection, but for self-reflexivity? And this, finally, the distinction between people and organizations who can cope with volatility and uncertainty and who can pivot as a result, and those who cannot from the perspective of labor and work is starker than ever. So just to close out, I realize I've made some very provocative statements and there's no time to explore them. But the conversation I really want to have is one about leadership. The leadership that you may have relied on, everything from models of governance to ways of managing staff, may have to change. As a board, you may have to become more active, whether it's in support of your leadership or to help manage situations, as opposed to, say, comfortably rubber stamping, especially in mature organizations. Policies that have been sitting around for a few years, like working from home, all of a sudden have new urgency, new immediacy, and you can't just let them sit there. Really, it's this idea, Marshall Goldsmith said, what got you here can't get you there. The problem is we don't know what there is. It's just that we can't take any aspect of leadership for granted. And as we go through today's topics, what my focus will be is leadership.
Thank you, Nadia. Provocative is good. Charles, you want to say a few words about the ideas or the observations that you have that you consider to be most important for the network members today?
Of course. I think for Toronto Dance Theatre, we're going through a transition because we had Christopher for more than 25 years at the lead and for more than 40 years as part of the company. But to step back from that and speak about sort of a micro, which, I mean, the pandemic is nothing micro, but if you look at the pandemic specifically, we honored all the contracts throughout the pandemic and have honored the contracts moving forward. We've had weekly meetings with the staff as we've come back now and been able to come back. So there's little things like that I think are changing, and they're not weekly meetings face-to-face, they're weekly meetings on Zoom. Like you were speaking, Nadia, these are the realities that no one ever thought we do when you're creating art. How do you create art on Zoom, and how do you sort of manage that creation of art? And there's certainly fear in what's coming next, and none of us know, though the numbers don't look good. Hopefully they plateau again and we flatten that curve. But I think that what we're doing is at that level preparing for whatever might come. And, the government has been, I can say, quite generous in its support of the arts, at least in the dance organizations, and helping us maintain a semblance of some normalcy in that way, and keeping people paid and keeping the lights on. But I think, I think on top of that, there's larger societal movements that have happened, starting with Me Too a few years ago, and with certainly it affecting, well, not the dance world specifically in Toronto, definitely the arts world in Toronto largely, and boards largely in that way too. And so we've certainly been dealing with that as it's been moving. And now with the Black Lives Matter movement, because of the timing with the pandemic, it's allowed us to sort of look at things like the City of Toronto's anti-Black racism unit with Tamla Matthews. And so we're initiating across staff, board, ensemble, and artistic week-long sessions with that unit. So that will be something that we can all take from every level of the organization and learn about our own, inequities, and also be open to learning about them. And then on top of that as well, we're doing the Indigenous Cultural Competency Training with Michael White through U of T. And so those are just 2 little steps that will help in the short term deal with some of what's going on societally. And I think as well, what we've done as a board, because of, which I can speak to later a little bit more because I don't want to take too much time now, but the process of hiring, of course, a new artistic director after 25 years was something of itself. But because of it, and because we do have a new artistic director, the board is energized in, I think, a new way as well, in so much as we are looking at things that have been, it's always been that way. But does that mean it should be that way? And I think that what these different societal movements are allowing us to do is ask those questions. Does it have to be that way? Can we do better? Should we do better? How do we do better? And I think that that's what it's allowed us to do. And I mean, our board, I can say, is definitely latching onto that and looking forward to sort of those challenges, which they are, but coming out the other side of it with a better organization.
Great, thank you, Charles. So Lisa Marie, a couple of thoughts from you.
Thank you, Jeannie. Can everyone hear me? Yeah?
Yeah.
And also, it's such an honor to be on this panel with Nadia, Charles, and Lucy. Thanks so much. And to be invited to talk about artist caregiver support in the performing arts. As Jeannie said, I am the artistic director at Theater Direct. So some people think because we're a theater for young audiences company, it's, of course, we're looking at how we can support artist caregivers because maybe we're all parents because we work with kids. But what's not so obvious to some is that there are caregivers working in all facets of our industry and theater companies across Canada who have been implementing their own creative measures to support artist caregivers. So in early 2020, Theater Direct launched Balancing Act. It's a new initiative funded by the Canada Council for the Arts, Sector Innovation Program, and the Metcalf Foundation Staging Change Program, aimed at creating more accessibility for caregivers in the performing arts. And building on the stories that we heard about different ways different companies have supported artist caregivers, our goal with Balancing Act has been to bring organizations together first in Toronto and eventually across the country to share best practices, test and evaluate strategies of support, and to share resources. Well, our first meeting of Balancing Act partners and steering committee members took place on February 21st, 2020, before the pandemic. And I remember organizational leaders from across the city, which were all women except for one man, just pointing that out. We sat shoulder to shoulder in our small Theater Direct studio to find out how we could push this initiative forward. Imagine that, sitting so close. In that meeting, representatives from Theatre Passe-Muraille, Nightwood Theatre, Why Not Theatre, Soul Pepper Theatre, Obsidian, the Toronto Fringe, Theatre Centre, PACT, Associated Designers of Canada, YPT, Quote Unquote Collective, were joined by steering committee members with regrets from other interested organizations, Chambly's Theatre, Crows, Prologue to the Performing Arts, Playwrights Guild of Canada, and Toronto Alliance for the Performing Arts. So as you can see, it's a movement that's growing across Toronto. And at this first meeting, Theatre Direct proposed a selection of actionable strategies that we would be deployed by the partners in the next season, such as on-site childcare, opening a family room at the theater, creating an infrastructure for touring artists with families, and forming a babysitting network. But adaptive approaches like flexible hours, working from home, job sharing were also on the table, though the practical applications of these strategies within the framework of production schedules and organizational structures at the time seemed more daunting. None of us could have been prepared for how drastically our relationship to work would be altered. And then, as we all know, in mid-March, COVID-19 hit. And suddenly we realized that, as Rachel Spencer Hewitt, who founded PAL, an organization similar to Balancing Act in the States, put it, work-life balance is everyone's urgent business now. So slowly arts organizations came to grips with the fact that there would be no next season, at least not in the way that we imagined. And at first we thought at Theatre Direct that we would postpone the Balancing Act strategy trials to an unknown time in the future when we'd all be back together in person. But it became evident quite quickly that artist caregivers needed urgent support now more than ever, having been instantly charged with taking over schooling and extracurricular activities on top of their workload with no options at all for childcare. So on May 22nd in 2020, Theatre Direct launched a revised version of Balancing Act with 4 new digital programs created to engage and support artist caregivers through the pandemic. You can read all about those strategies on our website, balancingactcanada.com. One was called Work That Works, was designed to explore the benefit that reduced working hours and task-based employment and guided creative play has on the mental wellness of artists, parents, and families. Another one was called Hack Lab, and it was about exploring process-informed intergenerational exchange, opportunities for artist caregivers to collaborate on creative projects from home alongside their children or their babes in arms. And the final 2 prototypes in our Reimagined Balancing Act were virtual camps for school-age children. And our aim for these programs was to effectively engage children in digital creative programming in order to provide parents with a window of time to work from home without distraction. So as we wrap up this virtual phase of the Artist Caregiver Initiative and we continue to navigate through this time of social isolation as a sector, it's our hope at Theatre Direct that the insights that we have gained will prove to be useful for organizations and artists, not only during this time of crisis, but as the other panelists mentioned, as we look towards implementing proven approaches to working flexibly and supporting artist caregivers in the future. And a full evaluation report for Balancing Act will be available by the end of the month on our website, balancingactcanada.com.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa Marie. So it looks like we're all agreed that the definition and challenges of decent work have changed in this time of crisis. So my question now is whether boards are considering these issues to be more important because they're also thinking about their organization's survival. So Lucy, I wanted to ask you, do you think that the active pursuit of decent work has carried over to board decision-making during these months, a full-on pandemic, and now as people are actually beginning to plan for, they are with hope planning for a new season?
Well, in my opening remarks, I gave 2 examples of decision-making that didn't necessarily happen because of the pandemic, but it's my take on the situation that the pandemic heightened the stresses and tensions that were already existing, and also made space for thinking about what the alternatives were. If Talk is Free Theatre had been in the middle of putting on a season, would they have had the capacity to think about, plan for, and launch their new basic income project? I mean, I don't know, but it's a question. And I wonder also if their board, their donors, and their funders would have agreed to fund the project. So one of the things I'm seeing is from my position outside of arts boards at the moment, is that there seems to be a lot more openness to try new things. Donors are being, and funders are being much more flexible and willing to take, how would I put it? Take the word of their funded organizations that this is what the organization needs to be doing in this moment, and less about what the funders' own objectives and goals are right now. So I'm hopeful that people are thinking hard and acting to make the sector a less harsh working environment. It can be a very harsh place. And then, of course, because this is in my nature, on the other hand, not to be complacent, just look what's happening at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, right? So that's an environment where clearly there was not a decent work culture in place, lots more work to do across the sector. But I am thinking that this taste of new things, new models, new paradigms is something that we will not roll back. if and when the pandemic is sorted.
One hopes. If nobody else, there's so much to say on all of these topics. I'm just going to bomb ahead if people don't mind. Remote work. People have been talking about that. And it's really becoming clear that working from home has not only completely changed the way people work and the way organizations function, but it's also really added to stress and overwork, which might have been surprising at the beginning. And it's uncovered this whole range of challenges for people, including arts workers and artists in many instances, who are low income, who might live in small spaces without, a home office, or even sometimes access to the technical equipment that they need to do their work. And not to mention, although Lisa, you did, the invisible parent tax, the cost and availability of childcare, dual full-time at-home work by spouses, and other hidden costs such as emergency babysitting, etc. We have seen all of that. So Lisa Marie and Charles, I'd like to speak to this. Are arts organizations stepping up to those challenges, and those who are doing it successfully, what are they doing?
I can talk for a minute here and then pass it over to you, Charles, if that's okay. Something pretty amazing actually was just announced today. We sent it out through Theatre Direct, that boards can pass along to their organizations. The Toronto Arts Council Theatre Program has just informed me that they have added childcare expenses to the list of eligible expenses for theater projects and operating. So that's not on their website yet, but they will be, that will be listed in the program guidelines starting in November, thanks to advocacy that many organizations have been doing. And I shared this on Facebook this morning. I think it's been shared about 100 times now. So that's really revolutionary. I think that these kinds of real changes are happening. So you could definitely tell organizations that you're working with that childcare expenses are a legitimate expense. The other thing I would pose is, have you asked the artistic director, the executive director, have you asked them about how they're doing, if their childcare needs are covered, if they need to allocate budget for this? It's very difficult for them to advocate for themselves. I know as an artistic director myself, we're always looking out for organization, but who's looking out for the artistic directors and the executive directors and their childcare needs? That being said, we also have to remember that it's often the most vulnerable in organizations that are overlooked. So, the artistic director is allowed to bring their kids, but what about the front of house manager? They're the ones most at risk of losing their job, and who we need to find a place for in the organization, and to support the artist parents of all of the staff and all of the artists that are working with us. I'll just leave you with a stat from a nationwide survey conducted by the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at U of T. Of over 150 caregivers working in the performing arts in Canada, the results of this study revealed that 79% of those surveyed had turned down work as a result of caregiving responsibilities, and 58% had never been asked about their caregiving responsibilities by their employer. And so, I said, have you asked, and has your organization asked the people that they're working with? And finally, do you have the budget? Well, that's a question too, but if we take an example of an organization that has a $500,000 annual operating budget, and you look at 3% of that budget is $15,000, I'll tell you that this would be more than enough to cover a lot of the childcare expenses and a lot of things that we can do to support artists, parents, and caregivers. So also people that are caring for the elderly, which is a situation many people are in now. Many of those things don't really cost much. It's about asking and finding accommodations. And those things that do cost much, is it worth 3% of your overall budget to make sure that these people can continue to thrive in your organization?
So Charles, it's not just about working from home, but it's also about all of the discussions, decision making, everything that goes into, for example, negotiating a new contract with a new artistic director, 3 weeks ago. So what have you been learning, or what has your organization been doing are you thinking differently? Are you putting new clauses into your contracts? What's going on?
Yeah, I think that we were lucky in that the process began so much, of course, a year ago, and it was a long-going process, and it was thankfully settled for the most part coming into March. So we were lucky in that we were settled in terms of the hiring was done, little things had to be done from it. And I will say, because of, we interviewed people from around the world, but mostly from across Canada, I learned how to use Zoom very well before any of this happened. So now when I do meetings for our board, I'm really adept at it for the most part. I still sometimes mute myself sometimes. But I think on the side of the organization, what I think to Lisa Marie's point, we've been realizing that, like I said earlier, some of the systems that we thought worked for everyone, and they've been in the manual, the 60-page manual for all the staff and for the ensemble, the dancers. When was the last time that was really looked at, and how does it apply to today, COVID, but also how did it apply to even a couple of years ago? Was it something that was written in the 70s, maybe the 80s, maybe the 90s, even in the early 2000s? And some things are just grandfathered through. And so what we've been trying to do in this time of COVID is ask the questions, ask the dancers, is this a good way to move forward? And one of the things we're doing is we're having flexible work hours, in so much as, so class in the mornings, instead of having to be there by a certain time, say 9 or 10, when rush hour would be at its highest, you can take class remotely as long as you're there for the performance part. So things like that, where we can adapt, because of course, when you're creating a dance piece, we might be able to do it separately and on Zoom, but really when it comes down to it, the piece is created together as a group in one room so far. And I mean, hopefully we won't have to push further than that with this pandemic. But little things like that, I think, are allowing us to have the capabilities to ask the questions and answer them if we can. And like everyone's speaking about, it is a budgetary thing too. The budget's really, I've been on the board for 10 years and the budget hasn't changed, but everyone's, costs have gone up, salaries have gone up, and as they should. And to the point as well of, management not always looking after themselves even, or taking, a hit. That was addressed just a few years ago, where I was like, you can't not also have a cost of living increase, because as a board's job, it's our job to make sure that all of our employees are looked after. And I know that, as a managing director or an artistic director, their job is to make sure the organization is viable, but at the same time, as people in that organization, they have to be treated well as well. And if that means more fundraising or moving things around, that we've been finding ways to do that. And it's been exciting. It's certainly daunting. You think that things are going really well and we've been assessed well and doing well, but then you find these little cracks that you didn't even know existed, and you're almost afraid to crack at it because you're afraid what it's going to open. But in opening it, sometimes, like we've all said, you have all these new ideas and new ways of approaching things. I think it's being nimble and being open to the possibility of change. And I think that's really what, we're speaking about today, really. That
is what we're speaking about today, I think. Nadia, I know that you have thoughts on this issue that we've just talked about, but I also would like you to talk to us a little bit about the change in social expectations and organizational expectations and individual expectations of ourselves about actively countering racism against Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our organizations. What do you think is the board's role in dealing with these social expectations? It just heightens the challenge of rethinking work in a pandemic. Are you seeing anything interesting with your clients or with other organizations that you've been observing?
Interesting is one word for it. Well, let me start by positioning myself. So I am a racialized person. I am not a Black person. So, I want to point that out with respect to anti-Black racism. So I really do position myself in terms of solidarity versus allyship, maybe. And that's one place where boards can have some serious reflection on, solidarity versus allyship. And to be honest, there may be a time and place for both. But it is a thing to explore. Um, you know, I tend to get called in crises, and equity has been a crisis, and acute for some and maybe chronic for others. And I'll leave it there. But so there's a couple of examples I can draw on. One is the idea of statements in favor of Black Lives Matter, right? So after the murder of George Floyd, I think every organization in the hemisphere like just fell all over themselves trying to craft and release statements, on sort of every platform and media, available. So lots of thoughts about statements, but here is where the board plays a role, because this is a leadership issue. So if you are going to put out a statement, to what end is that statement coming out? What is the purpose? What is the objectives? Can you back it up? Right? And what happens when your house is not in order and you've put out a statement to the public? And you get called on it. So that's one thing. The second thing is, the hill I will die on is that principled silence. I will take it any day over empty statements. And the lesson here is one of leadership or is one of reflexivity, because it's not just a statement. Like, are you thinking about a statement, or are you thinking about a commitment to action, for example? And what are the nuances here? And so as board members, what you need to expect, in fact, is that you're going to take it on the chin, coming or going, right? And like, this is not a time for expectation of accolades or gratitude or thanks, and I would also say that the distinctions are so sharp generationally that there really is a different set of expectations in a younger generation for that very visible, representative, identity-based, sort of call. And maybe it looks a little different in other parts, but I think boards really need to be thoughtful and ask really hard questions about why you're doing a certain thing, rather than just react to whatever the thing is that's happening in society. I'll also just quickly say, diversity is not those people over there, right? So if you're going to undertake an organizational initiative, it truly has to represent your organization. Whatever that is, it looks like, because, and I'll give you the example of a non-arts organization that did all the right things, right? They surveyed their staff. They were like, how do you want this to look? What do you want it to be like? And the feedback was, oh, it should all be people of color. And, I'm a white person, but I really, really want to do this, but I really don't want to, I really want to give the space to people of color. Lovely sentiments, really and truly. But from an organizational perspective, it's not going to work, because I guarantee within, a couple of months, you're going to have resentment, you're going to have conflict, you're going to have burnout. The racialized people are going to be like, why are we doing all this work? Where's everybody else? We can't hide behind, oh, it's like, equity is, again, not those people over there. So organizationally speaking, that initiative has to look up and down, and it has to be lateral as well. And finally, the very most practical advice I can give board members on the call today is, don't resolve your equity conflicts over social media. So please don't do that.
Good advice. Lucy, I didn't want us to forget about anti-harassment concerns and responses. I mean, it's so last year, but it isn't so last year. It's so all years and continuing and still. Do you have a couple of thoughts on that and the board's responsibility there?
Well, first, let me say that I am currently volunteering with the National Day of Conversation, which is an initiative that arose from the Association of Fundraising Professionals. And the idea is to raise awareness and come up with solutions to stop sexualized violence in the charitable sector. And it's coming from the point of view of fundraisers. And in a recent survey, more than 30% of fundraisers said that they had experienced harassment, often sexual, and that's 25% women and 6-7% men. So it's a huge problem. it's not gone away because these other equally important issues have arisen, like the important anti-racism work that needs to be done. So this is why you and I were both thinking about intersectionality as a huge and important issue. I think that women who make up a huge percentage of our sector are tired of waiting for action from above on the issue of sexual harassment. So the task really is to figure out how to organize, and to pick up on Nadia's point, the younger generation are much more comfortable with working together to stop harassment, but we still have a huge issue with donors, many of whom are also board members, using their position of power over younger and often younger and often vulnerable fundraisers. So what's clear to boards, Soulpepper being an example, the Metropolitan Opera situation being another example, is that whether they believe it's happening in their organization or not, they are leaving their organizations open to legal, financial, and reputational risk if they don't deal with it.
Huh. Thank you. True enough. So Jacqueline has cruelly reminded us that we're coming to the end of our hour. So what I wanted to do with some of the time remaining, I just want to throw out a couple of ideas, questions, and have whoever has something to say it. Jacqueline might be coming in with a couple of questions from our attenders. But one of my thoughts was about the people. The people are often hidden behind the term human resources. Do we consider artists to be essential workers? Do any of us? Are any of us thinking along those lines? And if so, what would that mean? I'm just going to ask another question right now. If an arts organization's budget is a demonstration of its value system, what about the idea of artists on full-time payroll? It doesn't happen very frequently, and that means that artists are even more vulnerable at a time like this than they were before, and they were plenty vulnerable before. And I wanted to bring forward Michael Enright, who I so regret had to retire, said this on May 1st on the Sunday edition on CBC. Companies, he's talking not of arts organizations, but of organizations in general. Companies will be judged by how they treat their employees, suppliers, and customers during this period of time, by who shared and who hoarded. Any thoughts there? Any maybe almost final comments?
Jeannie, I could respond to our arts workers, our artists essential workers. I would say that what's essential right now is taking care of each other. That for us to not forget that we're working in the middle of a pandemic, and that, you know, I'm hearing lots of conversations here and there about putting our artists together, but it might be risky, but maybe they'll bubble with each other and then wear a mask at home and things like that. I want to remind us that that excludes many people who have families at home because they can't bubble with the artists that they're working with. And also that if we take care of each other right now, then we will have an industry hopefully to come back to, and that we will come back differently.
Right. Right. Any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of, I have a limited perspective in terms of the organization I'm with. I mean, outside of it, I see our other organizations and other people, but I do know that we find it important, you know, when we were looking for an artistic director, you know, we all met and thought, what is one of the greatest assets of Toronto Dance Theatre? And yes, it's rich history of over 50 years, but it really is our ensemble, you know, and our ensemble changes, but it is something that has remained, you know, a year, but we've had an ensemble. Some people have been with us for over 10 years. And so when I recently met with them, we spoke about the fact that, you know, as art creators, as dancers, you're still employees and you're still protected by the same things that an employee at a construction site is protected by. I mean, it might be a little bit different. You don't have to wear a hard hat, but all those sort of same federal and provincial laws protect you. I think sometimes we forget that in the arts because we're just creating something and we have to do this and we only have so much time before we go on stage and all those sort of things. And I reminded them at the time, and I'm sure they knew it, but I felt it was important as the board chair to say, you are an employee and the board is here. Yes, it's for management and yes, it's to run the organization and the fundraise, but it's also to hear any complaint, any problem, anything that bothers you. If you don't feel comfortable going through the HR channel, which might be managing director in our case, I'm here and here's my personal number, here's my personal email. And I think that is something we somewhat learned from Me Too and Soul Pepper as boards. I hope most boards have learned from some of what went on there, not wanting to name that, but that is, certainly was a catalyst, I think, in the Toronto community. And I think that we just have to be reminded of that. And I think that arts workers are workers and they're protected and they should be. And like you said, Lisa, that in this time of COVID, it almost has to be doubly so. Even though we still all want to survive and we want to make art and we want to make sure that people see our art, we have to be mindful of protecting those that are most vulnerable. And sometimes that is the artist, the actor, the dancer, because they are the people that we put on stage and put at risk.
And I think we can all agree that it is the responsibility of board members as well as all of us to try to ensure that there is the possibility of full-time, lifelong work in the arts for young people who are starting out or middle-aged people who are having kids and realizing that it's bloody hard to have a child and, possibly have a co-op, a small co-op, and also spend a lifetime working in the arts. As a creative person who wishes to do that, we should be making it more possible than it has been, and truly something that people can look forward to with some confidence that it's going to work out for them. This is important to me particularly. I think there has been a lot of senior leadership transition in our community, and I think some of it, of course, is just generational, but I really do think that there are decisions being made by people who think that, believe that, feel that it's time for new leadership, it's time for others to take the reins. But in the meantime, boards and all of us need to make sure that looks possible for people these days. It may or may not be quite as, it was never easy, let's just say it was never easy, but it may be even harder now. Jacqueline, did we have some questions that you want to throw out at us? We're a little bit, are we over?
We're right on time. It's actually 5 o'clock, and we actually don't. We had a couple of questions that we addressed directly in the chat, particularly just about resources that do get sent out following the session. So actually, we are right on time.
All right. I think if people will stick with us for another couple of minutes, does anybody have one last final urgent thought that they wish to share with all of us on the call today? I'd welcome that.
I would just offer that board members, be mindful of the role of policy. And, in the arts, we tend to underdo policy. Like there's probably not enough, and it's probably not, it doesn't have enough flexibility. But I think I would also just caution people to say that policy can't save us either. It doesn't take the place of communication. It doesn't take the place of transparency. It doesn't take the place of relationships. It's a tool that helps all of these things, and it's very important in that respect. But like we can't, just like you can't legislate harassment away, even though it's a very important tool. Policy in and of itself is just one thing.
It's more important if it follows from a whole lot of conversation and deep thinking. It would seem to me that a policy that doesn't follow that kind of challenging of ourselves and of the organization probably has less chance of being at all successful in making any kind of positive change than one that is actually a result of some soul searching. Anybody else? Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
I can also mention, you know, when I think about this, I think if we support artists, then we're also not just supporting artists, caregivers, or artists, we're supporting the art form. Because as we try to move through this precarious time, if we can support artists and we can support our staff, then we will be able to create that rich art that we're longing to create when we come out on the other side of this, or as we transform the way that we make art. So it's not just about the people, although that should be enough, but it's also when we support people at these times of crisis in their life, in their career, at these huge life moments, like having children, taking care of an elderly person, going through a pandemic, then we are supporting them to come through so that at the height of their career, they're still there to create that beautiful art, piece of art that they've been training their whole career to create. So we're supporting the artists and the art form when we support each other through these moments.
So true. And I think that one of the themes that I hope we take away from this discussion is the idea that we are a creative community. We are based on values. We exist in order to question and to have an impact on the world and the discussion around us. And that applies just as much to board members, I would say, as to the artists and the arts workers, to whom that is their lifeblood. But this is a time, and I was glad that people said that it was, Charles, I think particularly, where we as board members should open ourselves, actually must open ourselves to new ways of thinking, to questioning the same old, and to a particular type of compassion and care for each other that should have been at the core of our organizations all along, and I hope it might have been, but really has to be at this point in time. Anybody else?
You know, I just to add to that, I mean, I think it was a wonderful summary. I think that, especially for board members, don't be afraid to make mistakes and be wrong as well. I think that's in all of us, but I think especially as a board, because we see ourselves as stewards of something so great, and that we've loved before we even become a part of it. We're an audience member first, usually, or, you know, and so I feel like, especially in these times, we need to be able to make little mistakes or to try things and say they don't work, or that was wrong, I shouldn't have done that, and move forward and accept that in ourselves. Because I think if we don't do that, we're just as much, I think it was Nadia that said, you know, when we make statements that are just statements but nothing comes of it, that doesn't move anything forward either. And in the same way, if we don't even do anything because we're so petrified that if we do it, it might change something and it's going to be wrong, then we're in that same position of not affecting that change. So we're human, and I think we have a lot on our shoulders as a board, but at the same time, we have we have the ability to make a lot of change. And I think that's behooves us not to try.
Maybe we need to start thinking a little bit more like artists think in the studio as they're creating pieces of work. You try, you fail, but by pulling together, something beautiful happens. And it's the process and the communication and the being together that and caring for each other and for the result that really makes a success. Oh my goodness. I'm so glad this was a positive conversation. It's been very hard for everybody, including board members. And I would like to sincerely thank the people who've joined us today. I hope that you came away from this discussion with a few thoughts and ideas that you can carry forward. And I would just like to say, good for you. I mean, it is so important at this point in time for really good board members who really care and want to do the best possible job to keep searching out answers and examples and good ideas from each other. So thank you, everybody. It's been a tremendous pleasure. Jacqueline, are there any, I'm sure there are housekeeping things I've forgotten. What have I forgotten? There will be resources up on the website, possibly by tomorrow or sometime soon. Anything else?
Yep, just to say that after this session, as with all sessions, we do send kind of an attendee post-evaluation survey. It's really quick. It'll be in everybody's inboxes first thing in the morning. We really do appreciate everyone taking the time to fill those out. It really helps us plan for future sessions. Otherwise, those resources will be posted on our website, as Jenny, you just did mention. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we did record this session. The recording, along with a transcription of the recording, will be made available about a week it takes to transcribe. So do feel free to share with peers that may have not been able to attend today.
Thank you, everybody. Very much appreciated. Very stimulating discussion. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye. Bye. Our
Thank
second
you.
wave. This is our second wave. Yay. Okay, bye-bye.